March 15th, 1945. North Atlantic, 200 miles west of Ireland. Captain Lieutenant Hans Kruger stood in the conning tower of U-857, scanning the horizon through his binoculars in the pre-dawn darkness. His Type 9C U-boat had been hunting Allied convoys for 3 weeks with minimal success. Improved Allied anti-submarine tactics, constant air patrols and escort carriers had turned the Atlantic from a German hunting ground into a graveyard for U-boats. Kruger's orders were simple but increasingly suicidal. Find convoys, sink ships, avoid detection, return home. The last part was becoming statistically improbable. What Kruger saw as dawn broke changed his understanding of naval warfare forever. On the horizon, silhouetted against the rising sun, appeared a shape unlike anything in German naval doctrine. An American Essex-class aircraft carrier, USS Boxer, steaming independently with a destroyer screen. No convoy, no heavy escorts, just the carrier and its protective destroyers, crossing the Atlantic as if German U-boats were irrelevant. Kruger's training said this was opportunity. His instinct said this was death. He would soon discover his instinct was correct. Kruger ordered battle stations and began his approach, staying submerged at periscope depth. The carrier was perhaps 12 miles away, close enough for torpedo attack if he could maneuver into position. He knew carriers were valuable targets. Sinking one would be a propaganda victory for a German navy that had achieved few victories lately. But as U-857 began its approach, Kruger noticed something that made his blood run cold. Aircraft were launching from the carrier's deck. Not one or two on patrol. Dozens. The sky filled with Grumman F-6F Hellcats and TBM Avengers, forming a combat air patrol that circled the carrier in overlapping patterns. Within minutes of U-857's periscope breaking the surface, one of the Avengers detected the wake. The aircraft dove toward the submarine's position, and Kruger screamed orders to dive deep. U-857 plunged toward crushed depth as depth charges exploded around her, closer than Kruger had ever experienced. The U-boat survived the first attack, but more aircraft were coming. The carrier had simply launched more planes, replacing those that dropped their ordnance and returned. Kruger realized he was facing something German naval planners had never adequately prepared for. An enemy that could project air power continuously, that could hunt submarines with aircraft on demand, that could defend itself with a screen of fighters and bombers that made surface or submarine attack almost impossible. Over the next 6 hours, U-857 played a desperate game of cat and mouse with aircraft from USS Boxer. Every time Kruger surfaced to recharge batteries or gain situational awareness, aircraft appeared within minutes. The carrier's radar had detected him beyond visual range. Its aircraft could respond faster than he could dive. The destroyer screen had positioned itself in a coordinated pattern that made any torpedo approach suicidal. Kruger attempted 3 separate attack runs. Each was detected and countered before he could reach firing position. By midday, with batteries dangerously low and hull integrity compromised from near-miss depth charges, Kruger made the decision that was becoming common among U-boat commanders. He abandoned the attack and fled. But flight proved as difficult as attack. The carrier's aircraft pursued U-857 for another 8 hours, forcing repeated crash dives that exhausted the crew and depleted remaining battery power. Finally, as darkness fell and U-857 limped eastward toward friendly waters, the pursuit ended. Kruger surfaced carefully, checking for aircraft that might still be hunting in the darkness. The sky was empty. The carrier had moved on, its mission apparently more important than hunting one damaged U-boat. Kruger radioed a contact report to U-boat command, describing the carrier and its capabilities. The response he received was telling. Break off engagement. Return to base. Your report confirms what we already know. We cannot effectively attack American carriers. They are too well defended. Their air power is overwhelming. The encounter between U-857 and USS Boxer represented a broader reality that the German Navy had been slowly, painfully learning throughout 1944 and early 1945. American naval power had reached levels that made traditional naval warfare obsolete. The U-boat arm that had nearly strangled Britain in 1942 was being systematically destroyed by escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, and anti-submarine techniques the Germans could not counter. The surface fleet that was supposed to challenge Allied control of the seas had been reduced to scattered vessels hiding in Norwegian fjords, emerging only for rare missions that usually ended in disaster. German naval strategy had been based on assumptions about warfare that American industrial capacity and technological innovation had rendered irrelevant. The Essex-class carrier that Kruger had encountered represented American naval construction on a scale Germany could not comprehend. USS Boxer was one of 24 Essex-class carriers built during World War II. Each displaced 27,000 tons and carried approximately 100 aircraft. The entire class was constructed in under 4 years, with some vessels going from keel laying to commissioning in less than 18 months. For comparison, Germany's only aircraft carrier, Graf Zeppelin, was never completed despite years of construction. The Americans had built 24 fleet carriers, while Germany couldn't finish one. But numbers alone didn't capture the qualitative gap. American carriers employed operational doctrines, aircraft, and technologies that the German Navy had never developed. The combat air patrol that had detected and pursued U-857 represented systematic use of radar-directed fighters to provide defensive coverage. The anti-submarine aircraft carried sonobuoys, magnetic anomaly detectors, and depth charges specifically designed for killing submarines. The carrier's damage control systems, crew training, and logistics support allowed continuous operations far from port. Every system had been refined through combat experience and supported by industrial capacity that could replace losses faster than combat consumed them. The aircraft themselves demonstrated American technological and industrial superiority. The F-6F Hellcat fighters that circled USS Boxer were purpose-built carrier aircraft with better performance than most land-based German fighters. Production exceeded 12,000 units, allowing pilots to train extensively before combat. The TBM Avenger torpedo bombers carried radar, advanced navigation equipment, and weapons loads that made them effective against submarines, ships, and land targets. American naval aviation had evolved into a flexible, multi-role force, while German naval aviation had never progressed beyond experimental units with limited capabilities. The radar that had detected U-857's periscope represented another crushing technological advantage. American shipboard radar by 1945 could detect submarines at periscope depth beyond visual range, track multiple targets simultaneously, and vector aircraft to intercept with precision German systems couldn't match. The carrier's Combat Information Center processed radar data, coordinated defensive responses, and maintained tactical awareness that gave American commanders overwhelming information superiority. German U-boat commanders operated partially blind, relying on visual observation and outdated intelligence, while American ships saw everything within dozens of miles. The destroyer screen protecting USS Boxer employed anti-submarine tactics developed through years of convoy battles. The destroyers maintained sonar contact continuously, communicated through encrypted radio, and coordinated with aircraft to hunt submarines in 3 dimensions. Their depth charges used proximity fuses that detonated at optimal depth automatically, dramatically increasing kill probability. Their crews had trained specifically for anti-submarine warfare and employed systematic search patterns that made evasion increasingly difficult. By 1945, well-coordinated destroyer screens could protect carriers against submarine attacks that would have succeeded in 1942. Captain Lieutenant Kruger's report upon returning to base described not just a failed attack, but a revelation about the naval war's true state. He reported that attacking American carriers was suicidal, that their defensive capabilities exceeded anything German intelligence had prepared him for, that their aircraft could hunt submarines more effectively than surface ships, and that the tactical situation had fundamentally changed. His commanders knew he was right. U-boat losses in early 1945 exceeded 50% on operational patrols. The happy time when U-boats had hunted Allied shipping with impunity was gone. American escort carriers, improved anti-submarine tactics, and overwhelming air power had turned the Atlantic into a killing ground for German submarines. The strategic implications were profound. Germany's navy had entered the war with plans based on commerce raiding and limited surface engagements. The U-boat arm was supposed to strangle Britain by sinking merchant shipping faster than replacements could arrive. The surface fleet would tie down British naval forces and perhaps achieve decisive engagements that would shift the naval balance. Neither strategy worked as planned. The U-boats initially succeeded, but American industrial capacity produced ships faster than submarines could sink them. American escort carriers and long-range aircraft closed the Atlantic air gap that had protected U-boats in mid-ocean. Improved convoy tactics, radar, and code-breaking reduced U-boat effectiveness while increasing their losses. The surface fleet story was equally disastrous. The battleship Bismarck was hunted down and sunk on its first operational sortie. The pocket battleship Graf Spee was scuttled after the Battle of the River Plate. The battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau achieved some early successes but were eventually sunk or damaged beyond repair. The super battleship Tirpitz spent most of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords, posing a threat but achieving little. By 1945, the German surface fleet consisted of scattered destroyers, submarines, and light units that could barely operate without being hunted by overwhelming Allied forces. Meanwhile, American naval power had grown to dimensions that would have seemed fantastical in 1939. The United States Navy by 1945 included over 6,000 vessels of all types. Fleet carriers numbered in the dozens. Escort carriers exceeded 100. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and amphibious vessels had been built in quantities that exceeded the combined navies of all other nations. American shipyards had achieved production rates that German planners considered impossible. Liberty ships, basic cargo vessels, were built at a rate of 3 per day at peak production. The industrial capacity required to sustain this construction, while simultaneously building aircraft, tanks, trucks, and weapons in millions of units, demonstrated an economic advantage Germany could never overcome. The technological innovations embedded in this numerical superiority multiplied American advantages. Proximity fuses made anti-aircraft fire devastatingly effective. Improved radar provided situational awareness that turned naval combat into chess games, where Americans could see the entire board, while enemies operated partially blind. Encrypted communications allowed coordination across hundreds of miles without fear of interception. Damage control training and equipment allowed American ships to survive hits that would sink vessels with less sophisticated systems. Logistics networks supported operations thousands of miles from home ports, projecting power globally while Axis navies struggled to operate beyond regional waters. The contrast in operational doctrine reflected these material and technological differences. American naval strategy emphasized carrier task forces that could project air power, establish sea control, and support amphibious operations. The carrier became the capital ship, with battleships relegated to escort and fire support roles. This transition from gun-based to aviation-based naval power occurred faster in the U.S. Navy than in any other fleet. By 1945, American carrier task forces could establish air superiority, suppress enemy defenses, and support ground operations with precision that made opposed amphibious landings feasible across the Pacific. German naval doctrine never completed this transition. German carriers remained incomplete. Naval aviation existed, but never achieved operational significance. The German Navy continued emphasizing submarines and surface raiders designed for commerce warfare rather than fleet engagement. This approach achieved early successes, but ultimately failed against Allied countermeasures and overwhelming production. By 1945, German naval strategy had devolved into defensive operations, attempting to slow Allied advances rather than achieving strategic objectives. The human cost of this naval disparity was staggering. German U-boat crews suffered 75% casualties during the war, the highest loss rate of any military branch in any nation. Over 30,000 German submariners died hunting Allied shipping, often in vessels detected and destroyed before they could attack. The American Navy suffered casualties too, but at far lower rates relative to forces engaged. Superior technology, better tactics, and overwhelming numbers reduced risk for American sailors while increasing it exponentially for their enemies. The psychological impact on German naval personnel was crushing. Kruger's experience of being hunted by aircraft he couldn't effectively fight, detected by radar he couldn't see, and pursued by forces he couldn't escape, became common for U-boat crews. Morale collapsed as casualty rates climbed. Experienced crews were killed and replaced with poorly trained recruits who died even faster. U-boat command continued sending submarines on missions everyone knew were likely suicide, maintaining offensive posture despite futility. The courage of U-boat crews deserves respect, but their sacrifice achieved nothing strategically by 1945, except delaying inevitable defeat. The technological revelations continued as the war ended. When Allied forces captured German naval facilities, they discovered that German technological development had focused on areas that mattered little to the war's outcome. Germany had developed advanced submarine designs including Type 21 boats with improved underwater performance. These submarines were genuinely innovative, decades ahead of Allied designs in some respects. But they arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. Resources invested in advanced submarine technology might have been better spent on aircraft, tanks, or conventional submarines in greater numbers. German emphasis on technical sophistication over mass production was a strategic error repeated across their military. American naval personnel who examined captured German equipment recognized both the quality and irrelevance of German innovations. German optics were superior. German torpedoes were more sophisticated. German submarines had better underwater performance in some configurations. But these advantages meant nothing against overwhelming numbers, better tactical doctrine, and technological superiority in areas that mattered more. Superior radar, communications, damage control, logistics, and most critically, industrial capacity to sustain operations and replace losses. These determined naval supremacy. Germany had lost the naval war before it began because they lacked the industrial base and strategic vision to compete with American material advantages. Captain Lieutenant Kruger survived the war and was interrogated by Allied naval intelligence officers interested in German perspectives on American naval power. His testimony, preserved in British archives, describes the psychological impact of facing overwhelming superiority. We knew by 1945 that we could not win. We knew that attacking American carriers was suicide. We knew our U-boats were being hunted more effectively than we could hunt convoys. But we continued operations because orders demanded it. The courage required to continue fighting when defeat is certain exceeds the courage required when victory seems possible. We had that courage, but courage alone could not overcome the material and technological advantages our enemies possessed. The day German Navy faced a U.S. carrier and saw America's true power was not a single day, but a gradual revelation that occurred across thousands of encounters throughout 1943, 1944, and 1945. Each encounter taught the same lesson. American naval power had reached levels that made traditional naval warfare obsolete. Their carriers projected air power that submarines and surface ships could not effectively counter. Their industrial capacity produced vessels faster than combat could destroy them. Their technological advantages in radar, communications, and weapons gave them overwhelming tactical superiority. By the time they understood the full scope of American naval power, they were already defeated.